I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The mountains were quiet this time of year, and my family had set up camp early, pitching tents and arranging sleeping bags while I lingered by the fire, enjoying the slow descent of the sun. The warmth of the flames contrasted sharply with the cool evening air, and the smell of burning pine filled my nostrils. My dog, a sturdy black Labrador named Max, sat loyally beside me, his head resting on my leg. I had a cold beer in my hand, the condensation chilling my fingers, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. My family had already gone to bed, tired from the long drive and a day spent hiking around the trails near our campsite. I told myself I would just sit a little longer, watch the fire, and enjoy the quiet. Max shifted beside me, his ears twitching at every small noise in the surrounding forest. At first, it was subtle. A branch snapping in the distance, the occasional rustle of leaves. But then he stiffened. A low, guttural growl rolled from his throat. I looked down at him, and he was tense, body rigid, hackles raised. I thought he might have spotted a raccoon or a deer at first, but the intensity of his growl made me pause. Max's eyes were fixed on something beyond the firelight, and his tail was stiff, not wagging, not moving, just still. I put my beer down and reached for my flashlight, trying to keep my movements calm. Max didn't move from my side, growling quietly but insistently. I clicked the flashlight on and swept the beam across the clearing, the forest edge, the faint trail leading away from the campsite. First, I saw nothing. The shadows of the trees stretched long and distorted in the light, and the distant creek reflected the moon in silvery flashes. Then, about 100 yards away, my light caught a movement. My stomach froze. It was a mountain lion. Sleek, muscular, its coat blending almost perfectly with the dark forest background, and its eyes reflecting the flashlight with an eerie, golden glow. It wasn't moving much, just watching, crouched low like it was assessing whether it was worth approaching. The sheer size of it struck me first. Larger than I expected, far bigger than any domestic dog or even the largest deer. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the hair on my neck stand on end. I remembered every story I'd ever heard about mountain lions in the wild. The warnings to stay calm, make noise, and not run. I stayed perfectly still, slowly scanning the surrounding trees and bushes. I thought about every camping trip I had ever taken, every time I had sat by a fire alone or let Max run ahead on a trail. How many times had I been in areas where mountain lions roamed freely without even knowing it? How many nights had I been asleep while a predator passed silently nearby? That thought made my heart pound even faster. Max let out another warning growl, more urgent this time, and I noticed the mountain lion shift slightly, its muscles tensing as if it was testing the boundaries. I knew the animal was aware of us now. It had detected our scent, seen the movement of the firelight, heard the soft snap of branches under my feet as I adjusted my position. The thought of it approaching the tents where my family slept made my chest tighten. I decided to move slowly toward the tents, keeping my flashlight trained on the mountain lion. I didn't want to turn my back. Every step felt deliberate, calculated, like walking a tightrope. Max stayed with me, alert, growling softly, but obedient. The forest around us was alive with sounds. The creek gurgling, leaves rustling in the wind, distant birds calling out, though mostly it was just the quiet menace of the night. Once I reached the tents, I took a moment to look around the campsite. Nothing had been disturbed. No sign of the mountain lion getting closer, but the unease was thick, almost palpable. I kept Max close, checking the surrounding treeline. The mountain lion was still there, crouched low among the shadows, watching, waiting. I could feel it sizing me up, but it didn't move any closer. Maybe it was cautious, maybe it was curious. Either way, I couldn't afford to take chances. I realized I had to prepare for a possible encounter, even though I hoped it wouldn't come to that. I moved quietly to the back of the tent where we kept extra supplies. I grabbed a long stick, one that could double as a makeshift weapon, and a whistle. I didn't want to provoke it, but I needed to be ready. My hands shook slightly, but I forced myself to stay calm, whispering reassurances to Max. He nuzzled my leg, but his body was still tense. For over an hour, I stayed by the tents, flashlight in one hand, stick in the other, and beer forgotten. The mountain lion didn't move much, just stayed low, watching. At one point, it leapt lightly onto a large fallen log about 50 yards from me, pausing to look around. Its muscles rippled with power, every movement precise and deliberate. I swallowed hard and reminded myself not to panic. I thought about how many times people get attacked, rare, but often fatal if caught unprepared. I was in the wild, truly alone with only Max and my wits. Eventually, after what felt like endless minutes, the mountain lion started to move away. Not running, not leaving in fear, just slipping back into the shadows of the forest, almost invisible against the dense foliage. I didn't follow it with my light. I just watched until it disappeared completely. Only then did I relax slightly, feeling a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. My adrenaline slowly faded, leaving me shaky but alert. I sat back down, holding Max close, letting the firelight warm me. I realized how lucky I had been. I thought about all the times I had camped in the mountains, all the trails I had hiked, all the nights I had spent sleeping under the stars without a clue that predators like this were so close. The thought was humbling, terrifying, and oddly exhilarating. Nature wasn't safe, it never promised safety, but it was real and raw and alive. By the time my family woke in the morning, everything was quiet. The tents were intact, the fire pit undisturbed, and Max was calm again, though still wary. I told myself that this encounter would stick with me, not as a tale of fear, but as a reminder. Preparation mattered, awareness mattered, and respect for the wilderness mattered more than anything. I made a mental note for the future. Hang the food, set up proper boundaries, always carry a flashlight, and never underestimate the animals sharing the forest. Driving back down the mountain later that day, I couldn't stop thinking about the mountain lion. Could have been dangerous, but it had simply observed and retreated. I realized that, for all the nights I had spent camping, I had probably been watched many times before without ever knowing. It made me respect the mountains even more, and reminded me that the thrill of camping came with responsibility, vigilance, and humility. That night, the wilderness had taught me a lesson I would never forget, and it made every future trip feel both more thrilling and more serious, knowing that the wild was alive, always present, always watching. I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. It wasn't far from the city, maybe a 3-hour drive, but it felt like another world once I got there. The map showed a small, remote campground tucked deep into the mountains, surrounded by dense forest. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sky a pale orange, the sun tilting toward the horizon. There was no cell service, which was exactly why I came. I wanted to get away from everything, but that isolation also made me feel a creeping sense of unease the moment I parked the car. The campsite itself was small, maybe just a dozen plots, scattered along a rough dirt road. A few campers were leaving as I pulled in, their cars kicking up dust. The forest around the site was thick and old, trees tall and close together, with shadows creeping like fingers across the ground. I picked a site at the far edge, near a slight rise. There was a small clearing, flat enough to pitch a tent, and a narrow creek nearby. The sound of running water was soothing, but the forest around it felt almost too quiet, as if it was holding its breath. I unloaded my gear and started setting up the tent. My hands shook slightly, not from fear exactly, but from anticipation. I hadn't camped alone in years. By the time I finished, the sun was almost gone, the sky streaked with dark purple clouds. I built a small fire, careful to clear the dry leaves and twigs around it, and arranged my camping stove nearby just in case. The smell of burning wood filled the air, and for a few minutes, I felt calm, sitting in the fading light, listening to the creek and the occasional bird call. Night came fast. The darkness fell heavy and thick, swallowing the forest whole. I went to bed in my tent, zipped up, and lay on my sleeping pad, trying to focus on the sounds I knew. The creek, the rustle of leaves, maybe the distant hoot of an owl. But after a while, I began hearing other noises. Small, deliberate sounds that didn't belong to the forest. Snaps, rustles, something moving through the underbrush. My first thought was deer or raccoons, maybe a fox. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the noises kept coming, getting closer, circling my tent, stopping, starting again. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, or maybe it was a large animal, something heavier than a raccoon. My heart rate jumped. I considered going out with my flashlight to check, but every instinct screamed not to. I stayed frozen, gripping my flashlight, waiting. The noises stopped for a long moment, and the forest was silent again, except for the creek. Then I heard it. A low sniffing sound, deliberate, almost investigative, right outside my tent. I froze. It was too high and methodical to be a deer, too heavy to be a small animal. My mind raced. Bear? Cougar? The thought alone made my stomach tighten. I remembered the rules. Make noise, don't run, stay inside. I unzipped just a tiny section of the tent and peeked out. My flashlight wasn't turned on yet. I wanted to see without drawing attention. The trees near my tent swayed slightly, but nothing moved. Still, the sniffing continued, circling the tent like it was mapping its way. I had packed a bear spray, tucked in my pack, but the idea of using it in total darkness, without knowing what it was, made me hesitate. My breathing was shallow, heart hammering. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. Then I heard it again, crunching over dry leaves, heavier now, and something brushed the tent. I yelped silently, pressing flat against the floor, clutching my flashlight and bear spray. It moved to the other side, rustling through my belongings, sniffing aggressively. I realized my food bag, which I'd left slightly unzipped, was the attractant. I cursed myself quietly. I should have hung it, but in my fatigue and excitement, I hadn't. I knew that any sudden movement might provoke the animal, so I stayed still, willing myself to be invisible. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it stopped. I thought it had left. I held my breath, waiting. After a tense silence, I peeked again and saw the outline of a large black shape disappearing into the trees. Relief washed over me. I didn't move, just lay there listening until the forest settled back into its normal sounds. I didn't sleep much after that, too keyed up, ears straining for every snap of twigs, every movement. Morning came slowly. I unzipped the tent, expecting calm sunlight, but the forest was damp with fog, the air cold and sharp. My campsite was a mess. My food bag had been torn open, scraps scattered, and my fire pit was disturbed, some of my carefully stacked firewood knocked over. I realized I had been lucky. What I'd encountered had been a bear, probably a large one searching for food. My heart pounded again at the thought of how close it had been. I packed up quickly, wanting to leave before nightfall. On the hike out, I kept looking over my shoulder, noticing broken branches, deep paw prints in the soft earth, crushed grass where it had padded through my sight. The forest looked different now, more menacing, as if it had been waiting for me to make a mistake. Every shadow, every rustle made me jump. I stayed on the main trail, moving fast, my backpack heavy, sweat chilling on my skin despite the cold. By the time I reached the parking area, exhausted and tense, I could see other campers already leaving, their cars packed. I felt a strange sense of gratitude that I hadn't encountered the bear again on the trail. I loaded my gear and got in my car, still shaking slightly. As I drove away, the forest receded, the mountains rolling away behind me, but the memory stayed sharp, as if every rustle and sniff was etched into my senses. I realized then that the forest didn't need to be supernatural to be terrifying, just wild, alive, and unpredictable. Later, back home, I unpacked my gear and inspected it. Nothing was missing, except the small amount of food scattered by the bear, and my firewood had been knocked around. I laughed softly at myself, at how scared I had been, but the memory of that night stayed. It was a humbling reminder. The wilderness wasn't a backdrop for adventure. It was a living, breathing place where I was not the top predator. The fear, the adrenaline, and the raw encounter with nature made the experience unforgettable. I promised myself I'd return someday, but not alone, and not without better preparation. I would hang my food properly, set up my campsite safely, and make sure I understood the wildlife around me. That night had been terrifying, yes, but it was also an education in the harsh reality of nature. And despite the fear, I knew I'd carry the lesson with me forever. A story I could tell that was as thrilling as it was true. I remember this one trip my parents took when I was younger, a camping trip somewhere in Arizona. I was too little to go with them, but my mom told me the story later, and it's stuck in my head ever since. She said it happened in Sabino Canyon just outside Tucson. She didn't tell it to scare me when I was little, but hearing it again as an adult, I can see exactly why she was shaken. It was early morning when my parents woke up at the campsite. The sun was just starting to hit the tops of the canyon walls, the kind of pink and gold light that makes the desert look almost magical. My dad was in a chipper mood, fiddling with the small portable stove he always insisted on bringing, while my mom was a little annoyed. She had wanted a quiet morning, but he was already humming and moving around, making the whole campsite feel busier than it was. Mom told me she didn't feel like arguing, but she was fed up with his energy. She decided she'd take a short hike on her own, just to get away and breathe. She grabbed her small day pack with water, sunscreen, and a granola bar, and set out down the trail near the campsite. The trail was narrow, winding through tall saguaro cacti, juniper trees, and low scrub that smelled faintly of creosote. The sun was just starting to climb, so the temperature was mild, perfect for walking. At first, the hike was peaceful. She could hear birds calling to each other, the faint rustle of lizards in the rocks, and the occasional wind moving through the canyon walls. She felt a little smug walking alone, away from the chaos of her husband's endless chatter. The trail curved around a bend, and that's when she saw him. A man was walking toward her, clearly on the same trail. The first thing my mom noticed was that he was completely naked. Not just shirtless, not just wearing shorts. Naked, head to toe. My mom froze, her stomach tightening. He didn't seem to care at all that she was there, that anyone might be there. He was just hiking along, moving steadily, his face set in a neutral, almost angry expression. For a moment, she considered turning back, retreating quickly to the campsite. But something about the way he was walking made her hesitate. He wasn't leering or making any kind of gesture toward her, which made her even more uneasy. It wasn't like a random stranger trying to shock someone. He seemed indifferent, like he belonged there, and she was the oddity. Her mind started racing. Sabino Canyon was known for hikers, but nudists? That didn't seem right. She scanned the horizon, trying to see if there were any signs, any hint that this could be a designated area for something like that. The man passed her, just a few feet away. She could hear the sound of his feet against the dirt, the faint scrape of rocks under his steps. His expression didn't change, and he didn't acknowledge her presence at all. She tried to focus on the trail in front of her, her eyes darting to the plants and the rocks, pretending he wasn't there, but her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. It was then that she realized she was very close to a part of the canyon where there were small, hidden paths that led to private areas. She remembered reading once about a nudist colony in the area, tucked away on a secluded part of the land. Suddenly, everything clicked together. He wasn't a threat. He was just part of a group that had chosen to live openly in that small corner of the canyon. Still, the initial shock had put her on edge. She kept walking, keeping her eyes forward, making sure to stay on the main trail. She didn't want to look back, didn't want to acknowledge him in any way. The canyon had a way of making sounds echo oddly, and every step she took seemed amplified. She could hear birds calling, but now it felt like the canyon itself was holding its breath. After a few minutes, she came to a fork in the trail. One path led back toward the campsite, the other deeper into the canyon. She chose the path back, not wanting to push her luck. She kept her pace steady, pretending to be absorbed in the scenery, though her mind was replaying the encounter over and over. The cacti looked taller, the rocks sharper, the canyon walls steeper than before. Every noise, a branch cracking, a rock shifting, made her jump. Eventually, she saw the campsite in the distance. The small tents, the morning sun reflecting off the top of the canvas, the faint smell of coffee her dad was brewing. Relief washed over her. She walked faster, eager to get back into a place where the ordinary world was intact. When she got back, her dad was still fumbling with the stove, looking entirely oblivious to the adventure she just had. She set her pack down, trying to calm her racing heart. He asked if she had a good walk. She just nodded, her voice tight. She didn't tell him exactly what had happened. Not at first. She needed a moment to process. Later, after the trip, she looked up information about the area. Sure enough, there was a nudist colony nearby, tucked away in a private section of the canyon. The colony wasn't advertised widely, but it was well known locally. She felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. Relief because there was no danger, no random madman in the desert. Embarrassment because she had assumed the worst at first sight, which made her heart pound for nothing. Even though it turned out to be harmless, she admitted that walking past a completely naked stranger in the middle of the desert had been one of the most uncomfortable, unsettling experiences of her life. The experience stuck with her, not as a story of fear in the traditional sense, but as a lesson in the unexpected strangeness of the world. Life, she realized, could be weird in ways you didn't anticipate. She often laughs about it now, telling me the story in a mix of horror and humor. She says the best part was how absurd it all felt. Arizona, the desert, Sabino Canyon, a nudist hiker walking through a normal trail, her annoyed at my dad. It was a perfect storm of weirdness. But she also says the moment she realized she was truly safe, that the man was not a threat, just someone living a different lifestyle, that clarity made her heart finally settle. By the end of the trip, she kept her hikes to well-populated trails and avoided the more secluded paths. She still enjoyed hiking alone, but she carried the memory with her. A reminder that sometimes, the scariest moments aren't dangerous. They're just unexpected, strange, and make you confront your assumptions. And for years afterward, she would tell me, with a mix of exasperation and humor, never underestimate the weirdness of Arizona. You think you're prepared for a hike, but sometimes, life just throws a naked hiker at you. A couple of years ago, my friends and I decided to go camping in Washington. We were used to the typical camping experiences: quiet forest mornings, the smell of pine, the faint sound of streams somewhere in the distance. But this trip ended up being one of the strangest and most unnerving I've ever had. We had chosen a small, tucked-away campground surrounded by dense evergreen trees. The ground was soft with pine needles, damp from an early morning drizzle, and the air was thick with the smell of moss and earth. We had set up our tents near the edge of the camp, close enough to the cars for convenience, but far enough to feel like we were out in the woods. Everything seemed normal at first. The usual rustle of small animals, the occasional call of a bird, and the soft whisper of wind through the trees were all present. We were unpacking, starting a small fire, and enjoying the calm of the forest when the first incident happened. Started with a sudden, sharp sound. I turned to see a pine cone bounce off the hood of one of the cars. Then another, then a stick, and then, almost instantly, more sticks, cones, and small debris rained down around the vehicles. At first, we thought it was just the wind. That area of Washington could get gusty, and we'd seen some branches already swaying in the breeze. But the pattern was strange. The debris wasn't falling randomly. It seemed targeted. One cone would hit the windshield, another would strike the roof, then another would land near the tires. I froze, trying to figure out what was happening. That's when I saw it. A squirrel, small but ferocious, perched high on a pine branch, its tiny body trembling with what could only be anger. Its eyes were fixed on the cars, and it was methodically pushing cones and sticks off the branch, sending them hurtling down with startling accuracy. Every time something struck metal or glass, the squirrel would leap to another branch and continue. The precision was unnerving. It was as if the squirrel had a personal vendetta against our vehicles. We didn't move at first. Part of me wanted to laugh. The idea that a tiny animal could act with such apparent intention was absurd. But there was something in the squirrel's energy, the way it moved and watched us, that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just playful or curious. It felt like aggression or maybe fear, but directed in a way that was deliberate. We tried to stay out of its line of fire, but nothing we did seemed to matter. Every few seconds, a pine cone struck somewhere near us, and we kept ducking instinctively, half expecting one to hit someone. The squirrel was relentless. I noticed that it seemed particularly fixated on one car in the camp. Maybe it smelled food inside, or maybe it had been nesting near that spot previously. I couldn't tell. But the way it targeted the hood and windshield made me wonder if we were dealing with something more territorial than normal. I grabbed a flashlight from one of the tents, thinking maybe shining a light near it would scare it away. But the movement of the beam only made the squirrel twitch and shift its weight. It was clearly calculating each throw. The situation escalated slowly but persistently. The more we tried to calm down, the more aggressive it seemed to get. Branches shook and cracked above us as it shifted between pines, and the sound of cones hitting metal or bouncing off the ground created a chaotic rhythm. My friend suggested leaving, but we were all rooted in place, torn between fear and fascination. It was like watching a force of nature, small and improbable, but undeniably powerful in its own way. Eventually, I decided to take action. I grabbed one of the larger sticks from the ground and gently tossed it near the squirrel, not directly at it, just enough to startle it. For a moment, it froze, ears perked, tiny body tense. Then it scurried up higher, chattering in a high-pitched voice that sounded almost like a warning. That was enough. We realized that direct confrontation might escalate the situation, and we needed a different strategy. We spent the next hour carefully moving our gear and ourselves out of the immediate strike zone. Each step was measured, each movement cautious. The squirrel watched us the whole time, following our positions with a keen, unsettling intelligence. The air was tense, thick with the smell of pine and the faint coppery tang of metal from where cones had struck the cars. Every so often, a small projectile would fly down, reminding us that we were still very much in its territory. By nightfall, we decided to retreat to the far end of the campground. We moved the tents, parked the cars slightly farther away, and created a barrier of camping chairs and logs to give us a bit of distance. The squirrel, after a final flurry of thrown cones and sticks, retreated to the upper branches, still chattering but no longer actively throwing. The forest became quiet again, though there was an underlying tension, as if the small animal was still watching and waiting for any mistake. We made it through the night without further incident, though sleep was almost impossible. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of needles, made our hearts race. The wind picked up slightly, and I could hear small animals moving in the brush, but none of them were as deliberate or unnerving as our relentless squirrel adversary. When morning came, we carefully packed up, keeping one eye on the high branches. The squirrel watched us leave, perched above, small but imposing, a reminder that even the tiniest creatures can hold sway over a space if they feel challenged. Driving away from the campsite, I reflected on the experience. It was scary, yes, but in a very different way than I had anticipated. It wasn't a bear, a storm, or any truly life-threatening situation. It was a small, wild animal asserting itself, reminding me that in the woods, we are always guests. Even a creature as small as a squirrel can disrupt our sense of control, and the forest has its own rules, independent of human convenience. That trip left me more aware of the unexpected. I've since been cautious about parking near dense tree cover, about the possibility of nesting animals, and about underestimating the intelligence and territorial instincts of wildlife. What seemed like a funny, minor annoyance turned into a tense, vivid lesson in respect for the creatures around us. By the time we drove away completely, cars loaded, tires crunching over the pine needle-strewn dirt, I felt a strange mix of relief and awe. It was over, and yet the memory stayed vivid. I could still see the squirrel's tiny, dark eyes, the way it calculated each throw, and the way it seemed to understand exactly how to dominate its space. It reminded me that the forest is alive in ways you never notice until you're directly confronted. And for the rest of that summer, every time I went camping or parked under the trees, I couldn't help but check the branches above, just in case. A few years ago, I had a series of camping trips that, in hindsight, were some of the scariest and creepiest experiences I've ever had in the wilderness. They weren't the kind of scary you see in movies, no ghosts, no monsters, just the raw unpredictability of nature and people. The first one happened with my wife. We were out in a forest full of jack pine, one of those sprawling, dense stands where the trees grow close together, and the ground is littered with dry needles that crackle underfoot. The forecast had warned about wind, but nothing that sounded alarming at the time. The wind picked up around mid-afternoon, gusts rattling our tent poles and snapping branches. By evening, it turned into a full-blown storm. The trees around our campsite were bending at impossible angles, creaking and moaning. Then came the first snap. A large branch broke off somewhere close by and slammed to the ground with a terrifying crack. Every other tree around us seemed to respond, their boughs thrashing violently. Pine needles rained down like green needles from the sky. The sound was deafening, almost like being inside a drum. We were both tense, holding onto the tent poles to keep our small shelter upright. The wind howled in between the trees, carrying strange, hollow noises, and the branches above us were falling unpredictably. Every few seconds, the impact of a branch hitting the ground made me flinch. I kept imagining a large limb smashing into the tent, or the entire tree falling over. The smell of crushed pine, wet earth, and ozone filled the air as the storm peaked. It went on all night, and sleep was impossible. The tent flapped violently, and every crash from above felt like it might be the last thing we heard. By morning, the forest was littered with broken branches, snapped trunks, and a ground carpeted with debris. It was a stark reminder that even in the woods you think you know, nature has the final say. A few months later, I had another trip, this time with my best friend. We were in a semi-remote camping area, a place that was drivable if you had a 4x4, but still far enough out that few people went there. The site was only semi-maintained. There were a couple of fire pits, some rotting picnic tables, and a rundown outhouse. The park staff only checked the place once a year, so it had the feeling of abandonment. The kind of place where you knew people could come and go, but you'd rarely see anyone. We were setting up camp when my friend wandered over to the outhouse. He disappeared behind the old wooden structure for a moment, then came back, walked over to the second stall, and returned a few minutes later. When he got back, he told me to check the first one. I assumed someone had left a mess. Maybe an animal got trapped, but what I found was completely unexpected. Inside the first stall were 3 massive backpacks. 2 of them were filled with decent camping gear, sleeping bags, tents, cooking supplies. Everything looked used, but in good condition, nothing suspicious. But the third pack was something else entirely. It was full of Skittles. Hundreds of them, bulk bags, small bags, tropical flavors, sour flavors, every kind of Skittle you could imagine, completely filling an 80-liter pack. My friend and I just stared at them, both of us confused and uneasy. Who would pack that many Skittles and leave them in a nearly abandoned campsite? The place was out of the way, and we didn't see another person for the entire 4 days we were there. Every night, the silence around the camp was heavy. The wind rattled through the trees, and we could hear distant animals moving in the dark. The Skittles packs sat untouched in the outhouse, still there when we left. We reported it to the conservation officers once we got back to civilization, but they had no explanation either. It was strange, unsettling, and honestly a little creepy. Someone had been there, but why, and why Skittles? The last trip was more adrenaline than curiosity. My dog and I went on a spur-of-the-moment overnight backpacking trip. I didn't want to haul a big tent, so I just brought a tarp and set up a minimal shelter. I had a small fire going, not really hidden, but not obvious either. The forest around me was quiet, filled with the usual night sounds: crickets, owls, and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I was just starting to drift off when I heard a truck tearing up a nearby trail. Loud, aggressive, carrying a bunch of drunken voices. My heart sank immediately. The next sounds were unmistakable. Gunshots, random and close enough that I realized they might be shooting in my direction. My stomach dropped, adrenaline surging. I grabbed my dog, tightened the leash, and moved quietly but quickly through the brush, keeping low and avoiding any clearings that would expose me. The forest was uneven, roots and rocks making every step a challenge, but I didn't stop. Every crack of a branch from the drunken shooters had me jumping. I found a safer path back toward the main road and didn't stop until the shots were far enough away that I could be sure I wasn't in danger. By the time I returned to civilization, the adrenaline was still coursing through my body, and I realized just how vulnerable I had been. The woods are beautiful, but they can also be unpredictable and dangerous in ways you don't expect, whether from nature or careless humans. Looking back on all three experiences, there's a common thread. The forest is alive, full of things you don't control. The storm in the jack pine showed me how small and insignificant we can be when nature decides to remind us of its power. The strange Skittles packs in the abandoned outhouse were a lesson in mystery and human unpredictability. Sometimes you'll encounter things that don't make sense, and the safest thing you can do is respect them, leave them alone, and move on. And the drunken gunfire during the backpacking trip was a reminder that not all danger is natural. Sometimes it comes from people careless and unaware. By the end of these trips, I had a deeper appreciation for preparation, caution, and observation. I learned to check the weather carefully, to pay attention to warning signs, to consider every movement and sound in the forest. I also realized that being alone in the woods, even in familiar places, is unpredictable. Every step, every sound, every shadow can hold surprises. I still think about those nights, the wind rattling the jack pine, the mysterious Skittles in the outhouse, and the gunshots echoing through the trees. I remember the adrenaline, the tension, the quiet moments of awe and fear. Those trips didn't end with any dramatic encounters. No heroic rescues, no life or death fights, but they left a lasting impression. They reminded me that the wilderness isn't just a place to escape. It's a place that tests your awareness, your instincts, and your respect for forces bigger than yourself. By the time I finally drove out of the last campsite, dog safely in the car, gear packed, and heart still racing from the near miss with the gunfire, I felt a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. Relief that nothing bad had happened, that we were safe. Satisfaction that I had faced the unpredictability of the forest, seen it for what it really is, and come out with a renewed sense of caution, humility, and respect. The wilderness doesn't owe you anything. You are just a visitor, and sometimes it lets you leave unharmed, sometimes it doesn't. Those trips, more than any other camping experience, hammered that truth into me. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The mountains were quiet this time of year, and my family had set up camp early, pitching tents and arranging sleeping bags while I lingered by the fire, enjoying the slow descent of the sun. The warmth of the flames contrasted sharply with the cool evening air, and the smell of burning pine filled my nostrils. My dog, a sturdy black Labrador named Max, sat loyally beside me, his head resting on my leg. I had a cold beer in my hand, the condensation chilling my fingers, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. My family had already gone to bed, tired from the long drive and a day spent hiking around the trails near our campsite. I told myself I would just sit a little longer, watch the fire, and enjoy the quiet. Max shifted beside me, his ears twitching at every small noise in the surrounding forest. At first, it was subtle. A branch snapping in the distance, the occasional rustle of leaves. But then he stiffened. A low, guttural growl rolled from his throat. I looked down at him, and he was tense, body rigid, hackles raised. I thought he might have spotted a raccoon or a deer at first, but the intensity of his growl made me pause. Max's eyes were fixed on something beyond the firelight, and his tail was stiff, not wagging, not moving, just still. I put my beer down and reached for my flashlight, trying to keep my movements calm. Max didn't move from my side, growling quietly but insistently. I clicked the flashlight on and swept the beam across the clearing, the forest edge, the faint trail leading away from the campsite. First, I saw nothing. The shadows of the trees stretched long and distorted in the light, and the distant creek reflected the moon in silvery flashes. Then, about 100 yards away, my light caught a movement. My stomach froze. It was a mountain lion. Sleek, muscular, its coat blending almost perfectly with the dark forest background, and its eyes reflecting the flashlight with an eerie, golden glow. It wasn't moving much, just watching, crouched low like it was assessing whether it was worth approaching. The sheer size of it struck me first. Larger than I expected, far bigger than any domestic dog or even the largest deer. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the hair on my neck stand on end. I remembered every story I'd ever heard about mountain lions in the wild. The warnings to stay calm, make noise, and not run. I stayed perfectly still, slowly scanning the surrounding trees and bushes. I thought about every camping trip I had ever taken, every time I had sat by a fire alone or let Max run ahead on a trail. How many times had I been in areas where mountain lions roamed freely without even knowing it? How many nights had I been asleep while a predator passed silently nearby? That thought made my heart pound even faster. Max let out another warning growl, more urgent this time, and I noticed the mountain lion shift slightly, its muscles tensing as if it was testing the boundaries. I knew the animal was aware of us now. It had detected our scent, seen the movement of the firelight, heard the soft snap of branches under my feet as I adjusted my position. The thought of it approaching the tents where my family slept made my chest tighten. I decided to move slowly toward the tents, keeping my flashlight trained on the mountain lion. I didn't want to turn my back. Every step felt deliberate, calculated, like walking a tightrope. Max stayed with me, alert, growling softly, but obedient. The forest around us was alive with sounds. The creek gurgling, leaves rustling in the wind, distant birds calling out, though mostly it was just the quiet menace of the night. Once I reached the tents, I took a moment to look around the campsite. Nothing had been disturbed. No sign of the mountain lion getting closer, but the unease was thick, almost palpable. I kept Max close, checking the surrounding treeline. The mountain lion was still there, crouched low among the shadows, watching, waiting. I could feel it sizing me up, but it didn't move any closer. Maybe it was cautious, maybe it was curious. Either way, I couldn't afford to take chances. I realized I had to prepare for a possible encounter, even though I hoped it wouldn't come to that. I moved quietly to the back of the tent where we kept extra supplies. I grabbed a long stick, one that could double as a makeshift weapon, and a whistle. I didn't want to provoke it, but I needed to be ready. My hands shook slightly, but I forced myself to stay calm, whispering reassurances to Max. He nuzzled my leg, but his body was still tense. For over an hour, I stayed by the tents, flashlight in one hand, stick in the other, and beer forgotten. The mountain lion didn't move much, just stayed low, watching. At one point, it leapt lightly onto a large fallen log about 50 yards from me, pausing to look around. Its muscles rippled with power, every movement precise and deliberate. I swallowed hard and reminded myself not to panic. I thought about how many times people get attacked, rare, but often fatal if caught unprepared. I was in the wild, truly alone with only Max and my wits. Eventually, after what felt like endless minutes, the mountain lion started to move away. Not running, not leaving in fear, just slipping back into the shadows of the forest, almost invisible against the dense foliage. I didn't follow it with my light. I just watched until it disappeared completely. Only then did I relax slightly, feeling a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. My adrenaline slowly faded, leaving me shaky but alert. I sat back down, holding Max close, letting the firelight warm me. I realized how lucky I had been. I thought about all the times I had camped in the mountains, all the trails I had hiked, all the nights I had spent sleeping under the stars without a clue that predators like this were so close. The thought was humbling, terrifying, and oddly exhilarating. Nature wasn't safe, it never promised safety, but it was real and raw and alive. By the time my family woke in the morning, everything was quiet. The tents were intact, the fire pit undisturbed, and Max was calm again, though still wary. I told myself that this encounter would stick with me, not as a tale of fear, but as a reminder. Preparation mattered, awareness mattered, and respect for the wilderness mattered more than anything. I made a mental note for the future. Hang the food, set up proper boundaries, always carry a flashlight, and never underestimate the animals sharing the forest. Driving back down the mountain later that day, I couldn't stop thinking about the mountain lion. Could have been dangerous, but it had simply observed and retreated. I realized that, for all the nights I had spent camping, I had probably been watched many times before without ever knowing. It made me respect the mountains even more, and reminded me that the thrill of camping came with responsibility, vigilance, and humility. That night, the wilderness had taught me a lesson I would never forget, and it made every future trip feel both more thrilling and more serious, knowing that the wild was alive, always present, always watching. I've never lived in a place where the woods were truly dangerous, not in the sense of bears or wild animals, and certainly not in the way some people warn about hidden things deep in the forest. I grew up around suburban parks and trails where the worst you might encounter was a stray dog or a patch of poison ivy. But I've always loved the idea of hiking long trails, especially the Appalachian Mountains, and I fantasized about camping out in the backcountry for a few nights, really getting away from everything. One summer, I finally had the chance. I was heading out for a solo backpacking trip along a section of the Appalachians I had been eyeing for months. The plan was simple: a 2-night trip, just me, my pack, and the forest. I had checked maps, packed food and water, made sure my boots were broken in. I felt prepared, over-prepared maybe, but that's how I like it. The first day was serene. I started early in the morning, the sun barely over the ridges. The trail was steep at times, winding between dense groves of oak and pine, moss-covered rocks making some sections slippery. Birds called to one another, a creek whispered beside the trail, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. I stopped a few times to catch my breath and take pictures, feeling a sense of peace I rarely felt in the city. By the late afternoon, I reached a clearing where I decided to set up camp. It wasn't far from the trail, but far enough to feel private. I picked a relatively flat patch of ground, cleared some leaves and twigs, and pitched my tent. The sun was lowering, casting long shadows over the trees, the way everything takes on a different shape in that golden light. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, the scent of rice and beans mixing with the forest air. Birds were quieting down, replaced by the occasional rustle of small mammals moving through the underbrush. As night fell, the forest felt different. Not menacing exactly, but alive in ways I wasn't used to. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, sounded louder. My mind started picking apart the sounds, imagining squirrels and raccoons and maybe a fox. But there was something else, something human. I couldn't pinpoint it at first. A low, metallic clinking, faint enough that I thought I was imagining it. I froze and listened. There it was again. A soft rhythm, like metal hitting wood, repeated in short bursts. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees near the clearing. The noise stopped. I strained my ears, trying to catch the sound again. That's when I noticed it. A faint glow, flickering through the trees about 50 yards from my camp. It wasn't the color of a flashlight or a headlamp. It was warmer, more consistent, like a lantern. My pulse quickened. I moved closer, careful to stay low and make minimal noise. The forest was denser here, the undergrowth thick, so I had to push through ferns and small trees. The glow grew slightly, and then I saw it. A small structure hidden in a dip in the land. Tin panels, a few barrels stacked nearby, and a makeshift chimney with smoke curling from it. The clinking sound I had heard came from a still. Someone was distilling alcohol right here, in the middle of the woods. I froze. I had heard stories about illegal stills in the Appalachians, but I had never imagined stumbling across one. It looked abandoned at first glance, but the smoke from the chimney told me otherwise. I could hear someone moving inside, soft shuffles and the occasional thump. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to leave quietly, but another part wanted to study it, to understand what I was seeing. I edged closer, staying down behind a fallen log. The smell hit me then. A sharp, yeasty smell, mixed with something chemical, almost sweet. I could see the outline of a large metal pot, hoses running into barrels, the faint glimmer of glass jars catching the firelight. Someone was tending it, stirring the contents, moving carefully. I realized I could be in serious trouble if I got caught. People who run these operations aren't usually friendly to strangers. I decided my best option was to retreat quietly, I marked the location in my mind, noting landmarks so I could avoid it on the way back. My hands shook slightly as I made my way back to the tent. The forest at night seemed heavier, the darkness more oppressive, and every rustle made me tense up. I kept telling myself it was just the forest, just the usual animals, but my imagination ran wild. I pictured someone stepping out from behind the trees, yelling, maybe even chasing me. Back in my tent, I couldn't sleep. I kept listening to the night, the chirping of crickets, the creak of trees, the faint wind. But I also kept hearing faint clinks and the occasional murmur of voices, just enough to make me tense. I thought about calling the authorities, but I didn't have a good signal, and I realized that any call could get me in trouble if someone traced it back. I was on my own. I spent the rest of the night in a state of nervous wakefulness, flashlight at the ready, every noise making me flinch. When dawn finally broke, the light filtering through the trees was a relief. I packed up quickly and stayed alert, moving down the trail faster than I had on the way in. I kept my eyes peeled for the still, just in case someone was still there, but I never saw another sign of it. The encounter stayed with me. I realized that yes, stills do exist in the woods, and you can stumble across them if you're hiking in remote areas. It's rare, but not impossible. The thrill of being in the wilderness suddenly takes on a different edge when you know there could be human activity that isn't meant for discovery. By the time I got back to a small town along the trail, I was exhausted but relieved. The forest had been beautiful, but it had also been unpredictable, and I had learned the hard way that solitude comes with unexpected risks. I left the area immediately after that, sticking to marked trails and areas known to hikers. I told myself it was a lesson. Respect the wilderness, respect its hidden occupants, and never assume that you're completely alone, even when it seems like you are. The still was gone from my thoughts, replaced by the memory of the forest itself. The smell of pine, the creak of trees, the uneven trail under my boots, the memory of the glowing lantern, the smell of fermenting mash, and the idea that someone was quietly working deep in the woods would never leave me. By the end of the trip, I had a renewed respect for the Appalachian backcountry. It's beautiful, wild, and full of surprises. Some pleasant, some nerve-wracking, some potentially dangerous. I kept hiking after that, but I always carried extra caution, always stayed alert, and always made sure I was prepared for anything. The woods are a place of quiet beauty, but also of hidden realities, and now I knew firsthand that sometimes those realities can be closer than you expect. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, itching to finally get away from the city and immerse myself in the backcountry. I wasn't from an area where encountering something like this was common, but I'd read enough online, threads, forums, and personal accounts to know that there were rumors about hidden stills in the remote Appalachian woods. People swore that if you stumbled across one, you were probably being watched, that someone could see you without you even noticing. I had always dismissed it as paranoia, the kind of thing people tell themselves to add a thrill to a hike. Until it happened to me. I arrived at the trailhead just after dawn, the air crisp and damp with morning mist. The mountains stretched ahead in ridges and folds, green and shadowed, the trail winding between thick forests of oak, hickory, and pine. I hoisted my pack and started up the slope, feeling the familiar ache in my shoulders and legs from the weight of my gear. The solitude was refreshing, the quiet only punctuated by birdsong and the distant murmur of a creek running down a narrow ravine. By mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for a campsite. The ground was level, covered in a thick layer of pine needles, and the canopy opened just enough to catch sunlight for a few hours. I pitched my tent quickly, trying not to linger too long and draw attention to myself. I had a small stove for dinner and plenty of water, but I wanted to make camp quickly so I could explore a little before nightfall. While collecting firewood, I noticed something unusual about the clearing. There were strange shapes in the underbrush, piles of tin cans and metal drums tucked against the tree line, almost hidden. At first, I thought it might be old camping debris, but then I noticed a faint glimmer, a soft metallic reflection in the late afternoon sun. My curiosity got the better of me and I edged closer. That's when I saw it. A small, makeshift still, partially camouflaged with branches and tarps. The pot was large and blackened at the bottom, hoses running into barrels, a faint smell of yeast and alcohol lingering in the air. I froze. The stories were true. People did operate stills in the woods, far from the authorities, and I was standing too close. I stepped back, trying not to make a sound, and noticed the faintest movement in the tree line behind me. My pulse jumped. I could almost feel eyes on me, someone watching my every motion from the shadows. I had read warnings online that this was common. People who run these operations are highly protective of their territory. Even casual hikers who stumble upon a still can put themselves in danger. I realized I needed to make a choice quickly, retreat quietly or try to seem non-threatening. I remembered reading that putting a log on the fire, if there was one, could be seen as a gesture of goodwill, an acknowledgement that you weren't a threat. There was a small fire pit near the clearing, smoldering from someone who had been there recently. My hands trembled as I picked up a piece of wood and gently placed it onto the coals. The embers flared briefly, a small orange glow lighting up the clearing. I froze, listening. There was no sound of movement, no voices, just the soft crackle of the fire. I thought I saw a shadow move behind a nearby tree, but it could have been the wind or the trees themselves. I forced myself to calm down, focusing on breathing slowly and evenly. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, imagining someone emerging from the woods, angry that I had been watching. But I also knew that the gesture might work, might signal that I wasn't a threat and wasn't going to report what I had seen. I stayed put for a few minutes, quietly observing, until the shadow seemed to recede. I took that as my chance to retreat. I didn't run. I knew that sudden movement could draw attention. Instead, I edged backward toward my campsite, keeping the still in my peripheral vision. Each step felt heavy, my heart hammering, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig making me tense. Back at the tent, I zipped the flap slowly, peering through the mesh at the fading light beyond the clearing. I could still smell the yeast, faint but unmistakable. My hands shook as I unpacked my stove and prepared dinner, trying to act as though nothing had happened, though my mind was on high alert. Every noise in the forest made me flinch. I had brought extra water and snacks, but I ate little, my appetite gone. As darkness fell completely, the forest became a different world. The shadows deepened, the wind whispered through the trees, and every small sound seemed amplified. I kept a flashlight handy, making brief checks outside the tent. The still was no longer visible, but the memory of the clearing haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching, maybe still was, even if hidden. I realized that being alone in these mountains came with layers of risk I hadn't fully appreciated. I spent a long night awake, listening, imagining eyes in the dark, convincing myself that caution was the only safe response. I thought about the stories I had read online, about hikers who had stumbled across stills and been threatened or worse. I tried to rationalize, reminding myself that most people operating these places were likely more concerned with their own work than harming a stranger who had not interfered. Still, the tension lingered, a knot in my chest that I couldn't undo. When dawn finally broke, the light of morning was a relief. The forest looked completely different in daylight, safer, calmer. I packed up quickly but deliberately, keeping my senses sharp as I moved along the trail. I avoided the clearing entirely, marking landmarks in my mind so I would know to steer clear on the way back. The forest seemed peaceful again, birds calling, a small stream trickling nearby, but the memory of the night stayed with me. By the time I returned to a town along the trail, I was exhausted and drained, but also relieved. I had encountered something real, something that reminded me the wilderness isn't just about wildlife or the beauty of solitude. It's also a place where human activity exists in hidden, sometimes secretive ways. I had survived without confrontation, without exposure, and without incident, but I had learned to respect not just the forest, but the people who use it in ways most hikers never see. That experience stayed with me for years. I never told anyone where the clearing was, and I made sure to stick to well-traveled trails after that trip. The still and the quiet, tense night became a story I carried as a reminder. Even in the most peaceful, isolated woods, there are hidden realities. Some are harmless, some are dangerous, and the line between the two can be razor thin. You walk lightly, observe, and respect both the wilderness and the people who inhabit it, even when they remain unseen. By the time I got home, I realized I had gained more than just a memory of the forest. I had learned about caution, about intuition, about how quickly curiosity can turn into danger, and about the thin line between the solitude we seek and the hidden eyes that may be watching. The mountains were beautiful, yes, but they were also full of unseen truths, and sometimes the real fear isn't the dark or the animals. It's knowing that someone else is out there watching, and that you're powerless to influence what they choose to do. I was maybe 13, too young to fully appreciate the risks of being alone in the woods, but old enough to feel like I was tough and independent. It was the first summer I went to that camp, the kind where you sleep in platform tents that sit just above the forest floor. The platforms themselves were simple wooden structures with thin mattresses, and the tents were nothing more than canvas stretched over poles. During the day, the camp was a whirlwind of activity. Hiking, swimming in the lake, climbing rocks, and learning to tie knots. But at night, the forest had a way of settling in around you, wrapping you in silence and shadows, and making everything feel larger than it was. The day had been normal, full of the usual camp chaos, with counselors making us clean up after meals, scramble for firewood, and try not to trip over tree roots on the hiking trails. I remember being exhausted when lights out came. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth from an earlier rain. I remember lying on my thin mattress, staring at the ceiling of my tent, trying to calm down the nervous excitement of being away from home for the first time. Eventually, I drifted off. What woke me up, though, wasn't anything I expected. I came to, not in my tent, but standing barefoot on soft forest soil. My first thought was confusion. My heart was already pounding, but I couldn't see much in the dark except for the vague shapes of trees around me. The canopy above was thick. The moonlight barely filtered through the leaves. My body was stiff, my legs sore, and I realized I must have been sleepwalking. I could remember standing up in the middle of the night, stepping out of my tent, and now I was somewhere. The air was colder here, thicker with mist that had settled between the trunks, and it smelled faintly of wet moss and decaying leaves. Panic hit me. I had no idea how far I'd wandered. The forest was silent, except for occasional rustling leaves and a distant, almost unidentifiable noise, like twigs snapping far away. Every instinct in me screamed that I shouldn't be here, alone, barefoot, in the middle of the forest. I tried to calm myself, telling my racing mind that I'd probably just sleepwalked a few feet from my tent. But when I looked around, nothing familiar was visible. I had no idea which direction the camp was. The platform tents weren't visible through the dense trees, and every direction looked the same. Dark trunks, shadows, and more trees. My first move was to try to retrace my steps. I took slow, careful steps, aware of the soil and hidden roots that could trip me. My bare feet pressed into wet earth, mud squishing between my toes. I imagined snakes, sharp sticks, maybe even wild animals. The fear made my heart race harder, but I forced myself to move. After what felt like an eternity, I noticed a small glimmer of light in the distance. At first, I thought it might have been a firefly, but as I focused, I realized it was consistent, steady. The kind of light that could come from another tent, a lantern, or some source from the camp itself. I stumbled towards the light, my bare feet scraping against small stones and roots. The trees seemed endless, shadows twisting as if alive, and every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. I imagined all sorts of things. Animals, other campers lost like me, maybe even someone following me. My mind raced, building stories faster than reality. When I finally broke through a denser part of the forest, the light grew brighter. I could make out the faint outline of tents in the distance. Relief washed over me in a wave that made my knees weak. I ran the last few steps, tripping over roots and barely catching myself on tree trunks, until I finally saw the familiar shape of my own tent. I collapsed inside, heart hammering, lungs burning. I sat on the mattress, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't say anything to anyone, Part of me was embarrassed. How do you explain waking up in the middle of the forest barefoot and alone? Part of me was still afraid that whatever had been out there could have followed me. But the light of the camp and the faint sounds of other campers sleeping felt reassuring. I kept thinking about how strange the whole experience was, how disconnected from reality it felt. My memory of the actual sleepwalking was fuzzy. I could only remember bits of moving through shadows, stepping over roots, and feeling the cold dampness of the forest floor under my feet. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed on the mattress, fully dressed this time, and kept glancing at the zipper of the tent, half expecting to see shadows moving outside. Morning eventually came, and the forest was no longer terrifying. The sunlight streamed through the trees, casting warm patterns on the ground. I could hear birds and the rustle of squirrels in the branches. My fear from the night before seemed almost ridiculous in the bright, warm light. When other campers and counselors started stirring, I avoided telling anyone about what had happened. Not out of shame exactly, but because sleepwalking didn't seem like a big deal compared to everything else in the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a part of the forest I didn't understand. Even years later, when I think about that night, I remember the way the darkness pressed against me, how the quiet seemed alive, and how vulnerable I felt, standing barefoot in the middle of something much bigger than myself. I know rationally that it was just sleepwalking, maybe a dream spilling over into reality, but the memory retains its edge because for a few minutes, the forest was absolute, and I was entirely alone in it. That summer, I started sleeping with my shoes by the tent, even when it felt silly. I learned the hard way how easy it is to be caught off guard in the woods. The sleepwalking never happened again, but the story stayed with me. The forest hadn't changed. It was still the same collection of trees, soil, and wildlife, but my perception of it did. I had glimpsed its silence in a raw, unsettling way, and I knew that even in daylight, the memory of that night would be lurking in the corners of my mind. Looking back now, I realize that was the real horror. Not some creature or alien, but how quickly normal life can slip away. How you can wake up, and for a few terrifying minutes, find yourself completely untethered, completely exposed. And yet, in the end, I survived. I returned to the safety of the tents, to people, to the smell of breakfast fires and sunscreen. I wasn't injured, I wasn't lost, and I learned something important about paying attention to my own body and the world around me. That night didn't leave me with a story of monsters. It left me with a story of survival, of awareness, and the strange, disorienting power of the human mind. Even now, I can close my eyes and picture the forest at night, and I still remember the faint lights of the camp in the distance. It's comforting and unsettling at the same time. That night taught me that fear doesn't have to come from anything external. Sometimes the scariest thing is just realizing how small and unprepared you are, how easily you can be lost, even when the world you know is only a few steps away.